The king lay dead on a stone table, while priests still washed, wrapped, named, and prepared his body as if Egypt had not finished using him. Behind the gold, perfume, linen, queens, heirs, temple offerings, and tomb rituals was a colder truth that most stories about pharaohs rarely explain. This was not just a world of strange customs or royal secrets, but a system where marriage, fertility, and divine power all gathered around one human body. The deeper you look, the less the pharaoh seems like a free man, and the more he becomes a sacred object claimed by an entire civilization. Tonight, we step quietly into that palace, that temple, and that tomb to see why ancient Egypt needed the body of one king to imagine the survival of the whole world. Before the story begins, take a quiet second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these slow walks through history. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is outside your window. It is always a little strange to think that the same ancient story is being heard in different rooms, cities, and nights around the world. So now dim the lights, let the room settle, maybe keep a soft fan humming in the background, and let us move gently into the hidden weight of pharaohs, temples, bodies, and ancient Egypt tonight. If one were to stand beside the Nile in the early morning, the world of the pharaoh would not first look like a life of endless pleasure. It would look measured, prepared, and under watch from every side. Sunlight touched the temple columns, resin smoke hung in the warm air, and servants waited with folded linen towels, water jars, trays of bread, bowls of oil, polished collars, and small vessels set in careful order. Behind the king stood priests, guards, fan-bearers, and officials, each person close enough to serve him but far enough away to remind everyone that he was not supposed to look ordinary. The pharaoh stood before the god not simply as a powerful man, but as the living center of Egypt's order. His body carried meanings beyond comfort, desire, or private choice, because kingship was tied to the river flood, the harvest, the temples, the army, the royal household, and the future of the throne. A modern viewer may imagine hidden rooms, soft beds, and endless indulgence, but that picture begins in the wrong place. Before the palace gave him pleasure, it gave him a role. In ancient Egypt, the king was expected to help keep the world in balance. The Nile had to rise, the fields had to receive dark mud, grain had to fill storage rooms, offerings had to reach the gods, and enemies had to stay beyond the borders. So crown, clothing, gestures, children, sacred, and even the woman who might bear his heir could all become part of this system. The crown, the linen, the oil, and the carved name beside him had already made his body part of something larger than private life. The strangest thing was not that pharaohs had unusual private lives. The more unsettling truth is that their private lives rarely stayed private. A marriage could affect succession, a birth could shift the palace, a child's name could raise one woman's status and weaken another's place, and a sealed record in a scribe's room could matter as much as a private promise. So near the throne, intimacy could become paperwork, ritual, and politics. It is almost absurd that the most powerful man in Egypt could still have his body dressed, washed, named, watched, and arranged for the needs of the throne. The objects around him made this easier to understand. A jar of scented oil was not only oil when it touched royal skin before the ceremony. A broad collar was not only jewelry when it framed the chest of a man presented as divine. A linen towel, a ritual chair, a water basin, a carved seal, and a royal name board could all help turn the king's body into an image of order. Priests did not watch the pharaoh as they would watch an ordinary worshipper. They watched the correct gestures, the clean hands, the proper offering, the right words, and the right posture before the divine image. Servants might carry sandals, towels, jars, and bowls, but those simple objects helped prepare a body that had to appear controlled and worthy. The king may have felt tired, hungry, bored or impatient, but those feelings had little place beside the offering table. Gods such as Horus, Isis, Hathor, Osiris, and Hapi were not just names in the background. They shaped how Egyptians understood kingship, fertility, motherhood, death, rebirth, and the life of the Nile. Horus was linked with royal power, Hathor with love, beauty, women, motherhood, and fertility, Osiris with death and renewal, and Hapi with the flood that made Egypt's fields fertile. These meanings gathered around the pharaoh until his body stood in the middle of a larger religious world. This is why pleasure is too simple a doorway into the subject. There may have been affection in the palace, and there may have been desire, comfort, jealousy, and ordinary human need. But around the pharaoh, those feelings were covered by duty, bloodline, ritual rank, and fear that the royal line might weaken. A woman near the king was not only near a man in fine linen, she was in the future of Egypt. The palace carried that message in quiet, practical ways. Wooden boxes held collars, sosik, seals, linen, and small containers of perfume. Water jars stood ready near doorways, scribes kept lists of names and titles, and servants moved through halls where private rooms were never fully separate from public expectation. In another part of the palace, a birthroom could become more important than a council chamber if the child inside it was accepted as the next heir. A modern ruler may worry about public image, but a pharaoh's marriage, children, body, sacred name, funeral, and family line could all be treated as matters of state. For ordinary Egyptians, the pharaoh's real body was distant. They might see his name carved into stone, his image painted on temple walls, or his authority carried by tax collectors, soldiers, and officials. They might never know his voice, habits, fears, or the expression he wore when no priest was watching. Yet the idea of his body mattered because it was tied to order, food, divine favor, and continuity. If the royal line looked uncertain, the palace could become dangerous without open violence. Mothers watched sons, servants carried news, officials measured favor, and priests cared about legitimacy as much as ritual. So newborn could lie wrapped in linen, while adults outside the room thought about inheritance, alliances, and survival. The child might not yet speak, but his name could already move people. That is why this subject must be handled carefully, so it would be easy to turn every fertility symbol, unusual marriage, royal birth, or later rumor into a cheap scandal. But ancient Egypt was not asking us to look only for secret pleasure behind palace doors. It was showing a world where the royal body could be religious, political, practical, and vulnerable at the same time. So what feels most unsettling is not that the pharaoh lived around strange customs, but that almost every personal part of him could be taken away and made useful to the kingdom. One can imagine him again in the temple morning, standing before the god while incense touched the air, and a priest held a vessel near the offering table. Near the wall, a ritual chair waited. A collar caught the light, and a servant kept folded linen ready for the next act of ceremony. The man inside the crown may have wanted rest, privacy, or one ordinary moment without meaning. The palace gave him symbols instead. So before any marriage, heir, queen, or rumour could matter, Egypt had already turned the pharaoh's body into a tool of sacred power. His life was personal only on the surface. Beneath the gold, oil, linen, and carved names, the throne reached into the body itself. This part has shown that the pharaoh's body was not treated as a private thing, but as a sacred instrument, tied to God's land, fertility, and rule. From there, the palace had to look toward the woman who might stand beside him and the child who might one day carry his name. And behind the calm surface of royal marriage, a woman's status could rise or fall around one frightening question: whether her body would produce the heir the court was waiting for. Inside a large room of the palace, marriage would not have looked like a private promise made between two quiet people. Painted columns stood in rows, Feather fans moved slowly in the hands of servants, and low tables held bowls of oil, linen cloth, small boxes of jewellery, and vessels of water prepared for the ceremony. Officials stood near the walls with their hands folded, while a young royal woman remained still beneath a heavy hat collar and carefully arranged hair. Her body was present, but so were her family name, her bloodline, and the child the court had not yet seen. The room already felt crowded before the marriage even began. For ordinary people in ancient Egypt, marriage could involve household life, property, children, work, affection, and family arrangements. It was not always a grand religious event like a modern wedding, and it should not be imagined as one single circumstance shared equally by every class. But royal marriage belonged to another level of pressure. Around the pharaoh, a woman did not enter only a home. She entered the future of the throne. That difference matters. The pharaoh's household had to think beyond affection. A wife might be loved, respected, ignored, favoured, or politically useful, but the court had to look at what her position could produce. If she bore a son who was accepted as heir, her place could become stronger. If another woman's child was recognised instead, the balance inside the palace could change quietly, through titles, gifts, rooms, servants, and names written by scribes. It is almost cruel how calmly a palace can turn marriage into a calculation, while still covering the room with flowers, oil, linen, and gold. A royal woman standing near the pharaoh might have been covered in beauty, but that beauty did not remove the weight placed on her. A broad could shine across her chest, bracelets could press against her wrists, and a servant could adjust the edge of her linen dress, while officials watched from a careful distance. On a nearby table, a seal might wait beside a record of names and titles. The objects looked graceful, but the meaning behind them was heavy. The palace was asking for continuity. In royal life, a child was not just a child. A child could become the next ruler, the proof of a line, the answer to a succession problem, or the cause of a new one. Before that child existed, people could already imagine him. Priests could think of divine order. Officials could think of stability. Mothers could think of rank. And rival families could think of danger. The unborn heir already had a shadow. This does not mean every royal marriage in Egypt happened in the same way, or that every woman near a pharaoh had the same story. That would be too simple and not honest. Different periods, dynasties, ranks, and families created different situations, and the evidence is not always complete. So what can be said more safely is that marriage around the pharaoh carried political and symbolic meaning far beyond ordinary household life. The court had more than romance in mind. The walls of temples and palaces helped strengthen that idea. Names of gods appeared in carved signs, royal titles were repeated, and images of kingship connected the pharaoh to divine protection. The woman beside him could be drawn into that language, especially if she became linked to fertility, legitimacy, or the mother of a future ruler. Porker could be understood through family, temple, court, and state at the same time. That was a difficult place to stand. A modern family may worry about inheritance papers after a death, but in a royal Egyptian palace, the question of who would inherit could begin before the child had even taken his first breath. So one can imagine the quiet, practical side of it. A servant carries a water jar through a side door. Another folds linen near a low chair. A scribe checks a name, a title, or a seal, while women of the household listen for news deeper inside the palace. So nothing has to look violent for pressure to fill the air. The danger could be ordinary. If the pharaoh died without a clear successor, the palace could become unstable. A royal son with strong recognition could help continue the dynasty, but a doubtful claim could invite dispute. A mother's status mattered because it could affect how people viewed her child. The child's name mattered because a name placed correctly in records titles, and public memory could make a claim stronger, ink could become power. The woman brought near the pharaoh therefore stood at a crossing point. She could be a wife, a companion, a political figure, a ritual presence, and possibly the mother of the next king. Her personal feelings may have existed, and they should not be erased, but the system around her often cared first about what her place meant for the throne. Her life could be decorated and confined at the same time. What feels most unsettling is that the softest things in the room, linen, perfume, jewellery, and a child's blanket, could all belong to a hard struggle over succession. This is why royal marriage should not be written as a cheap scandal. The real force of the subject comes from how controlled and practical it can become. A woman might stand under painted columns while people around her thought about gods, ancestors, titles, and future children. She might be treated with honour, but honour was not the same as freedom. The palace knew what it wanted. So before the pharaoh could think of private affection, the court had already thought about bloodline. Before a child was born, his place could be imagined. Before a woman became a mother, her body could be surrounded by expectation. In that world, marriage did not simply join two people. It helped arrange the future of Egypt. This part has shown that royal marriage around the pharaoh was not only about affection, but about bloodline, legitimacy, and the child who can continue. That pressure now moves toward the woman whose position stood clearest beside the king, the great royal wife. Sand behind her polished collar, sacred titles, and calm image in ceremony waited a colder question whether her place beside the pharaoh made her powerful, protected, or trapped inside the needs of the dynasty. The great royal wife did not stand beside the pharaoh only as a woman joined to him in private life. In the temple courtyard she could appear under the same heavy light that touched statues, offering tables, carved walls, and priests holding vessels of oil and wine. A broad collar rested on her chest, a black wig was arranged carefully around her face, and a headdress linked to divine womanhood could rise above her head. So in front of her, lotus flowers, bread, wine, incense, and small bowls of scent waited on the offering table. The scene gave her a role before it gave comfort. To a modern viewer, she might seem like a queen placed there for beauty. Her linen could look fine, her jewellery could look rich, and her body could seem part of the palace at Bisley. But in the royal system, the great royal wife was not only a decoration beside a powerful man, she could help show that the king's rule was complete, balanced, legitimate, and connected to the gods. That made her position heavy. In Egypt, royal power was often shown through carefully arranged images. The pharaoh stood with crowns, staffs, divine symbols, and names written in formal shapes. The woman beside him could add another layer to that image, especially when she appeared in ritual, bore royal children, or carried titles that placed her above other women in the palace. Her presence could help the throne explain itself. It is almost strange how calmly a court could turn a wife into part of the furniture of sacred power, placing her beside collars, incense, jars, and carved names as if everything had one purpose. The great royal wife could be honoured, but honour did not mean simple freedom. Servant might fasten a collar at her neck, adjust her wig, or bring a small box of oil for her skin before a ceremony. Another servant might carry a linen cloth, a fan, or a tray of flowers, while officials waited near painted columns. These objects made the scene look graceful, but they also showed how carefully her body had to be prepared for public meaning. She was seen through ritual. Female divine symbols mattered in this world. Sathor was connected with love, beauty, music, women, motherhood, and fertility, and royal women could be shown with headdresses or imagery that brought such meanings close to queenship. That does not mean every scene should be read as a simple statement about private life. It means the Queen's image could carry religious and political weight in a way that went far beyond personal charm. The palace knew the value of appearances. A queen could stand near the pharaoh in public scenes, but the pressure around her also reached into rooms that were not carved on temple walls. Her status could be tied to the children she bore, the titles she held, the family she came from, and the way scribes recorded her name. A sealed tablet, a royal name board, or a list of titles could give her place a lasting shape. Her body was public in one way, and her paperwork was public in another. A woman today may wear jewellery because it pleases her, but a royal Egyptian queen could wear a collar that helped the court speak about fertility, legitimacy, and divine order. This is why she should not be written as a silent figure behind the throne. She was also not simply a romantic partner or a beautiful image on a wall. Her role could combine marriage, ritual, motherhood, status, property, political connection, and sacred symbolism. The more important she became, the more people needed her to stand exactly where the system placed her. That is not a small thing. Inside the palace, her life may have included quiet routines that looked ordinary from a distance. There were boxes of linen, jars of perfume, rooms for dressing, servants carrying water, and children moving through spaces watched by nurses and attendants. Yet these ordinary objects could sit beside larger expectations. A birth room, a child's name, or a title written by a scribe could matter to more than any private wish she carried into the room. The soft objects were not always gentle. If the great royal wife produced a recognized heir, her position could grow stronger. If succession became uncertain, her title did not remove all danger from palace life. Other women, other children, other families, and other claims could exist near the same throne. The royal household was not simple because every relationship could be pulled toward inheritance. So what feels most unsettling is that her power and her confinement could come from the same place, her closeness to the pharaoh. She could stand beside the king in a ceremony and appear almost untouchable. She could be shown with divine signs, fine clothing, and ritual dignity. That dignity came with a price, because the system did not let her remain only a wife. It made her part of the way kingship proved itself to priests, officials, gods, and future generations. So the great royal wife belonged to more than a marriage. She stood in a place where beauty, religion, inheritance, and politics touched the same body. Her image could be calm, but the meaning behind it was heavy. The throne needed her to be visible, fertile, dignified, and useful. This part has shown that the great royal wife was not merely a woman beside the pharaoh, but a ritual figure whose body, titles, jewellery, and children could help support royal power. That pressure now leads to one of the easiest subjects for modern people to misunderstand. Marriage within the royal bloodline. Behind the polished collars and sacred names of the palace, family itself could be bent into a political tool, making relationships that feel shocking today appear useful to a court afraid of losing the throne. The ritual room would not have looked like a place built for gossip. Oil lamps burned near painted walls. Carved signs ran in straight lines above the figures, and two young members of the royal family stood under jewellery that made their shoulders look heavier than their bodies. A gold collar rested against the skin. Linen was arranged carefully by servants, and officials lowered their heads as if the matter belonged more to gods and ancestors than to ordinary family life. From the outside, everything looked calm. The discomfort sits under that calm. To a modern viewer, marriage between close royal relatives can feel instantly shocking. That reaction is understandable, but it can also lead the story in the wrong direction if it is treated only as a scandal or private desire. In the royal house of ancient Egypt, some close kin marriages appeared in certain cases, especially around kingship, inheritance, and the idea of keeping royal power inside the family. This should never be stretched into a claim about all Egyptians. The court was not the whole country. Ordinary Egyptian life could be very different from palace life. Families outside the royal household had their own marriages, property concerns, children, work, and neighbourhood ties, and the evidence for close kin marriage among common people is much more complicated across periods. The Pharaohs' family stood in a separate world where bloodline could be turned into a political and sacred argument. A relationship that looked disturbing now could be presented then as a way to protect royal identity. So it is almost cold how a palace could take something as basic as family and fold it into seals, titles, bloodline, the fear of losing the throne. The objects in the room help explain the pressure better than any scandal would. A carved seal could mark a royal name. Scribe's board could hold titles that made one person legitimate and another person easier to ignore. A jewellery box, a folded linen cloth, and a ritual chair could sit beside the same problem who had the right blood, the right mother, and the right place near the king. So nothing had to look violent for the system to feel hard. Power often speaks quietly. In a world where pharaohs were treated as more than ordinary men, the royal family was not just a family. It could be imagined as a line connected to gods, old kings, temples, and the stability of the land. Keeping marriage within the royal house could reduce the chance that an outside family would gain too much influence through the queen or her children. It could also make the new ruler appear tied more tightly to the sacred blood of the dynasty. That was the logic of the palace. This does not make the practice gentle, simple, or safe. It only explains why the court might have understood it differently from a modern audience. The people inside the palace could look at a close royal marriage and think first about succession, rank, divine ancestry, and political control. So private feelings of the people involved may have existed, but the system around them cared more about the line than the person. A modern family may see close blood marriage as a warning sign, but a royal court, afraid of rivals, could see blood itself as a wall built around power. The disturbing part is not only the closeness of the relationship, it is the way power could bend the normal meanings of kinship. Brother, sister, cousin, wife, husband, mother, heir and rival could become titles arranged around the throne. So a young royal person might stand under oil lamplight with gold on the shoulders, while older officials cared less about human discomfort than about where the next claim would come from. The gold did not soften the pressure. If a child came from such a union, that child could be surrounded by meaning before he could walk. His name might be written carefully, his mother's status might be remembered, and his closeness to the royal line might be used to support a future claim. In a birth room, linen could be folded beside a water jar while servants waited for news that might change the palace. The baby's first cry could become a political event. What feels most unsettling is that the same blood meant to protect the dynasty could also place the next child inside a web of expectation before he had any choice at all. This is why the subject has to be written with care. Close royal marriages indeed appeared in some Egyptian royal contexts, but it is not honest to turn that into a crude rule for all ancient Egyptians or a simple story of palace excess. The stronger truth is more uncomfortable. Royal power could make even family boundaries serve the throne, so people in that lamp-lit room may have looked dignified from a distance. Their collars shone, their linen was clean, and their names could be placed amongst grotesques. Yet, beneath the ceremony was a practical fear that ran through many royal households. The fear that power might pass into the wrong hands. The marriage was not only about two people standing together, it was about keeping the throne inside the bloodline. This part has shown that close marriage in the Egyptian royal house should not be treated as a cheap scandal, but as a practice tied, in some cases, to bloodline, divine kingship, and succession. That need to keep power inside the palace now turns toward the child born from such arrangements, because the smallest body in the royal household could carry the heaviest political weight. Inside a quiet birth room, a newborn wrapped in linen could become the centre of fear before his name was even fully secured. So birth room inside the palace would not have looked like a battlefield. White linen lay folded near a low bed. A small water jar stood beside the wall, and the smell of oil, herbs, and warm cloth hung softly in the air. Servant held a newborn carefully against her chest, while another woman gathered stained linen into a basket. Outside the door, guards stood still, and somewhere farther down the passage, a scribe could be waiting for a name. The child was small, but the palace around him was not. In an ordinary family, a newborn could bring worry, hunger, joy, work, and hope. Inside the royal household, those feelings could still exist, but they were covered by something larger. A child of the pharaoh could become a future ruler, a claim to power, a reason for favour, or a problem that other people wanted solved quietly. His first breath did not belong only to his mother. It belonged to the court. The mother's position mattered from the beginning. If she held a high title, came from an important family, or was recognized strongly beside the pharaoh, her child could stand closer to the idea of succession. If her status was weaker, the child's future might depend on recognition, timing, support, and the decisions of people who watched from outside the birth room. A folded cloth, a seal, a title, and a spoken name could all become part of the same question. Who would be allowed to matter? It is almost cruel that a baby who could not lift his own head might already change the rank of adults who had spent years trying to stay close to power. One can imagine the servant carrying him through a palace corridor. His body is wrapped in clean linen, his face half hidden, and his small hand rests against the edge of the cloth. Women in nearby rooms may hear the footsteps and understand more than the servant says. A guard may not move, but his eyes may follow the bundle for one short moment. So everyone knows a child can rearrange a house. The danger did not need to look dramatic. It could sit in the quiet space between one mother and another, between one title and another, between one child named publicly and another child kept lower in attention. A wooden box of baby cloths, a small amulet, a water bowl, and a royal name board could appear harmless on a table. But if the pharaoh died without a clear heir, those objects could suddenly seem connected to survival. The palace feared uncertainty, so succession was not only about blood, it was also about acceptance. Son could be born, but he still needed recognition, support, and a place inside the royal order. Priests, officials, royal women, military men, and powerful families might all care about which child was seen as legitimate enough to continue the throne. The baby did not understand any of this. His name did the work for him. Child today may enter a family with toys, blankets, and whispered hopes. But a royal child could enter a palace where his blanket lay, beside questions of inheritance, titles, and political safety. This is why the story should not be told like modern romantic drama. The important point is not simply which woman the pharaoh favoured or which room he visited. The larger issue is how the court understood children born near the throne. A child could strengthen a mother, weaken a rival, reassure officials, disturb another branch of the family, and make servants more careful with every rumour they carried. The cradle could become a signal. A woman watching from another doorway might not need to say anything. Her face could remain calm, her collar could sit straight, and her linen dress could show no sign of anger. Yet the birth of another woman's child might alter her own future, especially if her son had once seemed closer to the throne. The palace could keep its voice low while its balance changed. That quietness made it colder. If the air was clear, the royal household could appear stable. If the air was doubtful, every small detail could gain weight. Which child was named first, which mother received honour, which servant was assigned to which room, which official recorded the title, and which image appeared later in public memory could all matter. power often survived through details. Symbolism is that a newborn could be loved, held, washed, and wrapped like any other child, while also being used as a living answer to the fears of a dynasty. The baby had no ambition. He did not know the throne, the gods, the army, or the old kings whose names filled temple walls. He only needed warmth, milk, cloth, and arms to hold him, but the adults around him saw a future that reached beyond his body. They saw protection, risk, rank, and the possible continuation of Egypt's royal line. This made royal birth both tender and dangerous. So a mother could look at her child and see flesh, breath, and need, while the palace saw succession. A servant could carry him gently through the corridor, but the quiet behind each doorway might already be measuring what his existence meant. The child had entered the world before he had entered himself. This part has shown that a royal child was not only a son or daughter of the pharaoh, but a fragile body surrounded by names, titles, mothers, and fears of succession. When the air was not clear, that pressure could spread backward into the most private rooms of the palace. Behind a closed bedroom door, the question of who might bear the next child could turn intimacy into a silent struggle without a single sword being drawn. At night, the palace could look almost peaceful from the outside. Oil lamps reflected on painted walls, a servant moved slowly through the corridor with a water jar, and the smell of linen, oil, and warm stone lingered near the closed doors. Behind one door, a mother might sit beside a sleeping child. Behind another, someone else might wait for news from the scribe's room, where a lamp still burned beside tablets, seals, and lists of names. The silence did not mean safety. After many years of a pharaoh's rule, the royal household could become crowded with expectations. There might be wives, women of rank, royal children, older relatives, servants, tutors, nurses, officials, and families connected to different branches of power. This should not be imagined as a later-style fantasy court filled only with seduction and jealousy. In ancient Egypt, royal women's spaces could also connect to family, life, labor, property, administration, children, and palace management. The danger was more practical than glamorous. When no heir was clearly accepted, every relationship near the pharaoh could gain weight. A son's age mattered, his mother's status mattered, the support of officials mattered, and the way his name appeared in records could matter. A woman who had once seemed secure might become anxious if another child gained attention. A mother with a weaker title might still hope that timing, favor, or recognition could raise her son. It is almost frightening how a palace could make a child's blanket, a mother's title, and a scribe's seal feel as important as soldiers at a gate. The corridors carried more than footsteps. Servant bringing clean linen could also carry news without meaning to. A nurse leaving a child's room could be watched. A small box of amulets, a royal name board, or a sealed record placed on a low table could become part of a larger pattern people were trying to read. Nothing needed to be shouted. The palace listened quietly. This is why royal intimacy could become political. The question was not only who the pharaoh loved, but also which woman received his attention. The deeper question was who might bear a child recognized by the court, whose child might be named in the right way, and which branch of the royal family might gain strength because of it. So in that world, the private room was never fully sealed off from the throne room. A closed door could still cast a shadow. The women around the pharaoh should not be reduced to a crowd of beautiful figures waiting behind curtains. Some could have titles, property, servants, family ties, ritual roles, administrative connections, and children whose futures mattered, as their lives were shaped by more than desire. They lived inside a system where favor, motherhood, rank, and recognition could decide how safely they stood near power. A modern household may argue over inheritance after someone dies, but in a royal palace, The struggle could begin while the ruler was still alive, and the children were still being watched by nurses. The uncertainty could sit inside ordinary objects. A folded linen cloth near a bed, a small water vessel near a birth room, a bracelet left on a stool, or a scribe's tablet with a name half finished could all belong to a quiet struggle over recognition. So mother might not need to speak openly for others to understand what she wanted. A servant might lower her eyes because she knew which door had come important. The rooms had memory. If the pharaoh grew old or ill, the pressure could become sharper. So officials might think about continuity, priests might think about legitimacy, and families might think for survival after the king's death. A son who was too young, a mother without strong rank, or another child with better support could all become reasons for anxiety. Palace politics did not always need open violence. It could work through waiting. So what feels most unsettling is that the soft parts of palace life, sleeping children, perfumed oil, folded cloth, and quiet women's rooms, could hide the first movements of a succession crisis. This does not mean every royal household fell into chaos, and it would be dishonest to write every palace as if it were constantly filled with plots. So the point is more careful than that. When succession was unclear, the structure of royal life made competition possible because many people's futures were tied to the same throne. The pharaoh's private life could create public consequences. That is what made it dangerous. By morning, the palace might return to order. Servants would carry water, officials would stand near columns, children would be led through shaded spaces, and scribes would continue writing names as if nothing had changed. Yet behind that calm, the question of the heir could remain alive in rooms where no weapon was visible. The struggle could sit in posture, silence, title, access, and memory. So a palace did not need to look violent to be divided. This part has shown that when the heir was unclear, the quiet rooms of the royal household could become slaves where motherhood, rank, records, and favour carried political danger. So that pressure now leads toward the women around the pharaoh, who should not be treated as a decorative crowd or a simple fantasy of palace desire. Among the fans, linen boxes, perfume jars, children's rooms, and sealed records, some of these women stand inside a hidden system of property, family, status, and influence that shaped the throne without appearing openly on it. The palace courtyard would not have been filled only with silent beauty. Women moved through shaded spaces in fine linen dresses, servants carried wooden boxes, and children of the royal household played near painted columns while attendants watched closely. A manager sat with a writing board, marking the amount of cloth, oil, food, perfume, and gifts that passed through the household. Near one doorway, a woman of rank stood with a broad collar on her chest and a servant holding a folded fan behind her shoulder. This was not just decoration. The women around the pharaoh should not be imagined as a simple crowd waiting behind curtains. Some were queens, some were royal mothers, some were princesses, some came from foreign courts, and some held practical positions inside palace life. Their roles could touch childbirth, ritual, education, property, diplomacy, household management, and the future of royal children. A palace needed bodies, but it also needed records, storage rooms, workers, servants, and names written correctly. The quiet spaces had structure. A woman in the palace could bring more than personal beauty. She could bring a family connection, a title, a claim, a group of servants, a set of gifts, or a child whose future mattered to many people. A wooden chest at her feet might hold linen and jewellery, but the more important things around her could be harder to see. Sealed jar, a property note, a ration list, or a title copied by a scribe could tell the palace where she stood. It is almost lazy to imagine these women only as ornaments when some of them stood beside boxes, seals, children, servants, and accounts that could affect real power. Ancient Egyptian women in general could have legal rights that are striking when compared with those of many other ancient societies. Depending on class, period, and circumstance, women could own property, inherit, make contracts, appear in legal settings, and divorce. That does not mean every woman was equally powerful or equally free. Status still mattered, wealth mattered, family mattered, and life inside the royal household was shaped by rank at every turn. The palace was not equal. Inside the royal court, these differences could become sharper. A king's mother might hold memory, respect, and access that younger women did not have. So a great royal wife might stand with ritual dignity and public recognition. A princess could become important through marriage, diplomacy, or her relation to a future ruler. A foreign woman might arrive with gifts, servants, and political meaning tied to another kingdom. Each name carried weight. The daily objects around them make the scene less like fantasy and more like administration. Linen had to be counted, perfume jars stored, foods distributed, servants assigned, children supervised, and gifts recorded. Women's spaces could be connected to weaving, production, storage, childcare, and courtly display. Same courtyard that looked soft with fans and flowers could also function as a working of royal power. A modern viewer might notice the jewellery first, but the palace may have cared just as much about the seal on a storage jar or the name written beside a woman's title. This is why the word desire is too small here. Desire may have existed, and affection may have existed, but the system around the pharaoh did not run only on attraction. It ran on access, recognition, children, property, ritual, and family networks. So a woman who seemed distant from open politics could still matter because her son, her brother, her father, or her household, the staff, connected her to a wider chain of influence. Power often moved through rooms that did not look official. One can imagine a servant carrying a box of scented oil through the courtyard, while two women watch from different doorways. A child runs near a column, and an older attendant calls him back before he gets too close to a group of officials. Scribe lowers his brush to mark another delivery of linen, while a nurse carries a royal child toward a shaded room. Nothing in the scene looks like a council meeting, but several figures may be sitting inside it. That is the strange part. What feels most unsettling is that the palace could hide serious influence inside ordinary things. A child's nurse, a folded cloth, a gift box, a ration record, or the quiet respect given to one woman's name. This does not mean every royal woman was secretly ruling the palace. That would be too simple. It means the women around the pharaoh formed part of a system that cannot be reduced to charm or desire. Their lives could include motherhood, ritual, property, labour, rank, diplomacy, education, and competition, all under the pressure of the throne. So the palace courtyard should be seen more carefully. The linen dresses, fans, perfume jars, children, and jewellery were real parts of the image, but they were not the whole image. There were also accounts, titles, kinship ties, political favours, and gifts moving through the same spaces. Behind what looked graceful, there could be a whole structure of influence. The women were not in the background. Part has shown that the women around the pharaoh were not simply decorative figures, but part of a palace world shaped by property, family, children, ritual, and rank. That wider system now leads to the women who came from beyond Egypt, entering the royal household through diplomacy rather than personal choice. So among the gold, travel chests, foreign servants, and sealed gifts, a princess could cross the desert, not as a bride in a love story, but as part of a political agreement that might leave her alone in a palace where even her language was not fully hers. A foreign princess entering Egypt would not have arrived like a woman walking freely toward romance. Her journey could begin far from the Nile, with donkeys, carts, guards, servants, wooden chests, folded cloth, jars of scent, metal goods and gifts packed carefully for a royal exchange. Dust would cling to the wheels, the animals, and the edges of her linen while the people around her watched the road ahead. When she finally saw the Nile, Egyptian soldiers might already be waiting near the water. The river was not home. To later eyes, this kind of movement can look like an exotic love story. A princess from another land is brought to a powerful pharaoh, surrounded by gold, servants, and ceremonies, and the imagination fills the empty spaces too quickly. But in the world of kings, the movement of royal women could belong to diplomacy, alliance, tribute, peace, and recognition between courts. Her body entered the palace, but her arrival had been planned by men thinking about kingdoms. That is the colder part. A foreign princess could carry more than jewelry. She might bring attendants who spoke her language, chests of cloth from her homeland, gifts marked for Egyptian officials, and memories that no one in the palace fully understood. A wooden box at her side might hold a comb, a piece of woven fabric, a small personal object, or a scent that reminded her of the place she had left. Around her, Egyptian scribes and servants would see titles, gifts, and political value. It is almost cruel how a girl could cross the desert under the weight of gold and still arrive with almost nothing that truly belonged to her. This does not mean every foreign royal woman had the same fate. Some may have gained status, comfort, property, servants, and a respected place inside the court. Others may have lived with distance, isolation, and little control over the political meaning of their presence. The evidence does not allow us to invent every private detail, and it would be dishonest to create a secret bedroom story where the records are silent. The safer truth is already heavy enough. She had been moved for power. Strong kingdoms, marriage links, or the transfer of royal women could help confirm peace, soften rivalry, display submission, or create a visible bond between rulers. Egypt did not exist alone, and its court had to deal with neighboring powers, distant kings, trade routes, military pressure, and diplomatic language. So a woman entering the palace could therefore be part of a message sent between courts. Her arrival might say that one kingdom recognized another. The person became the agreement. The palace would have turned her into part of its own order. Servants might unpack her chests, count the cloth, store the jars, and place gifts where officials could inspect them. A scribe might record the items, the names, the origin, and the rank attached to her arrival. A room would be prepared with linen, water vessels, oil, stools, boxes, and perhaps servants who knew some of her habits. A modern bride may worry about leaving one household for another, but a foreign princess could leave an entire language, landscape, family, and court behind her. Her loneliness would not need to look dramatic. She could appear in small moments when a servant misunderstood a gesture, when a familiar word had no answer, or when food, scent, and sound all felt slightly wrong. She might stand in a courtyard where the walls were beautiful, the jewelry was rich, and the servants were careful, yet none of that could replace the place she had known. The palace could be full and still feel empty. The gifts did not solve that. One can imagine her watching Egyptian women move through the palace with confidence. Some knew the hierarchy, the servants, the titles, the proper ceremonies, and the quiet rules of rank. A foreign princess had to learn where to stand, when to wait, who could be trusted, and what her presence meant to people who saw her first as a diplomatic object. Her personal feelings could exist, but the palace would translate her through status. That translation could be harsh. What feels most unsettling is that a woman could be carried into Egypt with perfume, gold, and attendants, while the real purpose of the journey was written in politics long before she saw the river. This is why the story should not be pushed into fantasy. Strange part is not a hidden scandal, but the fact that a royal woman could be moved across borders because her presence helped kingdoms speak to each other. Her body, her name, Her servants, her gifts, and perhaps her future children could all become part of that exchange. A private life began inside a public agreement. By the time she entered the palace, the road behind her was already closing. The chests would be opened, the gifts counted, the servants assigned, and her name placed into a new world of Egyptians' titles and expectations. She might gain comfort, but comfort was not the same as belonging. The Nile could be beautiful and still feel like exile. This part has shown that a foreign princess entering Egypt was not simply a bride in a strange love story, but a royal woman carried into diplomacy, alliance, gifts, and isolation. That movement now leads away from palace rooms and toward the temples, where the meaning of fertility was larger than marriage itself. In the sacred spaces of Egypt, birth, crops, river mud, cattle, and human bodies could all be gathered into one unsettling idea, that survival itself depended on fertility being watched, honoured, and controlled. Its royal marriage had shown how birth and succession could shape the palace, but the temple made that same idea wider. Fertility was no longer only about the woman beside the pharaoh, the child who might inherit, or the names written by scribes in palace rooms. It reached into fields, cattle, river mud, grain stores, funerary rites, and the belief that life had to return again and again. In the temple, this was treated with care, not embarrassment. Tall columns threw shade across the courtyard while priests carried offerings toward the divine image. Smoke rose from incense, and the pharaoh stood with flowers, bread, wine, green plants, and small bowls of scent arranged before him. On the walls, carved figures placed bodies, gods, fields, animals, water, and royal names into one ordered picture. A modern viewer might notice the strange parts first, but the Egyptians were looking at life itself. It is almost strange to modern eyes that fertility could stand so openly beside gods and offerings, yet in Egypt this was not treated as a joke or a dirty secret. The reason was simple and practical. Egypt depended on the Nile, and the Nile did not feel like a background detail to the people who lived beside it. If the flood came well, the soil could receive rich mud, grain could grow, animals could feed, storage rooms could fill, and families could survive another year. If the water failed, hunger could move through villages long before anyone spoke of sacred symbols. The same thought sat inside the temple offerings. Bread pointed back to grain, wine pointed back to vines, labour, vessels, and ritual use. Green plants suggested growth and renewal. A bowl of water, a tray of food, a carved river sign, or a bundle of plants could carry more meaning than a modern person might expect. Fertility was not only human. Gods such as Hapi, Hathor, Isis, Osiris, and Geb helped shape this way of thinking. Hapi was connected the Nile flood, abundance, food, and the fertile life of the land. Hathor carried meanings linked with love, beauty, women, motherhood, and fertility. Isis could be understood through motherhood and protection, while Osiris joined death, renewal, and fertility in a way that made rebirth part of the sacred order. Before going deeper, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if you enjoy this calm kind of history. It helps the story reach more people who want ancient history told slowly, carefully, and without cheap scandal. Then return to the temple courtyard, because the strangest parts of this subject are not hidden in palace gossip, but placed openly beside bread, incense, water, and carved stone. A modern person might separate religion from farming, childbirth, animal breeding, and death. Ancient Egypt often connected them. The field needed fertility, the family needed children, the herd needed new life, the dead needed renewal, and the royal house needed continuity. These were different parts of the same fear, that life could fail if order was not maintained. A person today might lower their voice around such subjects, but an Egyptian priest could place fertility beside bread, wine, river mud, and divine order without treating it as shameful. This does not mean every temple image should be read as a literal record of private behavior. That would be a mistake. Egyptian religious art worked through symbols, formal scenes, divine meanings, and ritual language. A carved body, a fertility sign, or an unusual divine image could speak about renewal, abundance, royal duty, or cosmic balance, rather than a simple act from daily life. That careful reading matters. The pharaoh's role inside the temple made the subject even heavier. When he offered flowers, food, wine, or plants, he was not simply showing personal devotion. He was presenting himself as the ruler who helped keep life in order, from the riverbank to the granary, from the royal household to the tomb. His own body, already tied to heirs and sacred kingship, stood inside a larger system where fertility belonged to the whole country. One can imagine the scene without making it vulgar. The pharaoh stands before the god, priests hold vessels near the offering table, and incense leaves a faint mark in the air. Outside the temple, farmers think about water, mothers think about children, herdsmen think about animals, and scribes think about grain. Inside the temple, those ordinary needs are lifted into sacred form. What feels most unsettling is that fertility in this world was not simply personal. It was watched, honoured, shaped, and tied to the order that held Egypt together. So when Egyptian temples placed fertility near gods, crops, water, and rebirth, they were not treating it as a scandal. They were showing how fragile life could be in a land that depended on the river's return. The palace had made birth political, but the temple made fertility cosmic. The body, the field, the animal, the child, and the dead all belong to the same larger fear of life ending. This part has shown that fertility in Egyptian temples was not treated as shame, but as a sacred sign of river floods, crops, children, animals, rebirth, and order. So that serious temple world now leads towards a fertility god who shocks modern viewers more quickly than almost any other figure. The pharaoh stands before the god Min with offerings in his hands, while a symbol that looks startling today was treated as a solemn sign of life, harvest, and power. In a temple space connected with Min, the scene would not have been treated as a strange joke. The pharaoh could stand before the god with offerings in his hands, while priests remained still behind him and carved signs covered the stone around them. A tray might hold lettuce, bread, flowers, oil, or small vessels prepared for ritual use. To modernize, the image of Min can feel startling at once, but the people who stood there were not looking for amusement. They were looking at life. Min was a fertility god, and that word meant more than one thing in Egypt. It could point toward human reproduction, but it also reached into the soil, the crops, the animals, the river's return, and the continuation of daily life. In a land where hunger could follow a poor flood, fertility was not a soft idea. It was practical, sacred, and tied to survival. The symbol was serious, so this is where modern viewers can easily misunderstand the scene. They may see the body of the god first and stop there, as if the image were only meant to shock. But ancient Egyptian religion often used the body to speak about forces larger than private behavior. So divine body could become a sign of strength, abundance, harvest, and the power that allowed life to continue. It is almost too easy for modern people to laugh at an image that an Egyptian priest might have approached with incense, offerings, and complete seriousness. The offering of lettuce to Min is one of the details that makes the scene feel more grounded. Lettuce was not only a vegetable sitting on a tray. In this ritual setting, it could be connected with fertility, growth, freshness, and divine force. The pharaoh presenting such an offering was not simply feeding a statue. He was performing a role in which the ruler stood between the gods and the life land. The vegetable carried meaning. Around the offering table, the objects were ordinary and sacred at the same time. Bread came from grain. Oil came from labor, storage, and preparation. Flowers and green plants pointed toward renewal. A priest holding a vessel, A servant arranging a tray, or a carved hand reaching toward an offering could all belong to a ritual language that treated life as something that had to be maintained. Nothing there was casual. For an agricultural society along the Nile, fertility could not be separated from food. Crops had to grow, herds had to reproduce, families had to continue, and the royal line had to remain secure. Min's image belonged to that larger world. It was not only about the body of one god, but about the anxiety that life might fail if the powers of growth and renewal were not honoured. So a modern person may see a shocking religious figure, but an Egyptian farmer might have cared more about whether the field, the herd, and the grain basket would survive the year. The pharaoh's role before Min also mattered. As king, he was expected to support divine order through ritual. So when he stood before a fertility god, his own body and office were again pulled into the question of life continuing. He was not only a ruler giving an offering, he was the royal figure who had to appear capable of keeping abundance connected to the kingdom. The crown stood beside the crop. This does not mean the ritual should be turned into a crude story. That would be the easiest mistake. The image of Min can be described clearly, but the meaning should remain tied to temple worship, agriculture, divine power, and Egyptian ideas of life. If the storyteller makes it only about vulgar surprise, the whole point disappears. The scene becomes smaller than it was. One can imagine the temple wall, the god's image, the carved signs, and the pharaoh holding the offering in a fixed pose. The air smells of oil and incense. Priests stand in silence while the objects on the table speak through their placement. The body of the god may startle a modern viewer, but inside the temple it belonged to a serious pattern of fertility and abundance. What feels most unsettling is not the image itself, but the distance between modern embarrassment and an ancient world that could place such a symbol at the centre of sacred order. Min shows how carefully this subject has to be handled. The strange part is real, but it is not a license to invent dirty scenes or turn the temple into a joke. Ancient Egypt used divine bodies, offerings, crops, animals, and royal gestures to explain the forces that kept the world alive. So what looks shocking from far away can become more serious the closer one looks. That seriousness changes the whole story. This part has shown that Min was not treated as a comic or vulgar figure, but as a fertility god tied to crops, animals, offerings, royal ritual, and the continuation of life. So that meaning now leads toward the female divine world, surrounding queens, mothers, beauty, music, and royal womanhood. Through Hathor, the same force of fertility could appear not as a shocking male symbol, but as a polished headdress, a queen's collar, and a sacred image of motherhood placed directly beside power. So after the startling image of Min, the temple world could turn towards something softer but not weaker. A queen or princess might stand in a golden courtyard with a broad collar on her chest, fine linen falling around her body, and a carefully arranged wig beneath a headdress linked to Hathor. Servants held lotus flowers nearby. Musicians stood behind with small drums and stringed instruments, and bowls of scent rested near the offering table. The scene looked graceful, but it still belonged to power. Beauty was not only beauty here. Hoth the Buds connected with love, joy, music, beauties, women, motherhood, and fertility. That made her image important in a world where royal women could be seen not only through marriage, but through ritual, protection, and the stability of the throne. When a queen appeared with symbols connected to Hathor, she was not simply being dressed to look pleasing. Her body was being placed inside a sacred language. It is almost too easy to mistake the queen's jewellery for decoration, when the collar, headdress, flowers, and music could all help the court speak about divine womanhood. The headdress mattered. The horns and sun disk linked the royal woman to a goddess whose meanings reached across pleasure, motherhood, fertility, and protection. Servant might adjust the edge of the linen, Another might hold a box of oil, and a musician might wait for the signal to begin. From a distance, the queen could seem calm and beautiful, but the image around her was carefully built. The court understood the presentation. This does not mean every queen should be reduced to a symbol. She could have family ties, property, children, private feelings, servants, and political relationships that do not fit neatly into one scene. Still, royal imagery could take her body and make it speak for something larger, so a woman beside the pharaoh could become part of how the throne showed balance, fertility, and divine approval. The person and the symbol stood together. In the palace, the same meaning could appear through smaller objects. A jewelry box, a perfume jar, a folded linen cloth, a child's amulet, or a written title could all help define a royal woman's place. Her beauty might be praised, but the system cared about more than how she looked. It cared about what her image could support. So a modern viewer may see a queen dressed for a ceremony, but an Egyptian court could see motherhood, fertility, protection, rank, and legitimacy gathered into one public body. Hathor reminds us that fertility in Egypt was not always presented through startling images. It could appear through music, flowers, scent beauty, motherhood, and formal grace. The temple could turn softness into authority. A queen standing under Hathor's signs could carry a kind of power that looked gentle but still served the throne. That softness had weight. One can imagine the courtyard after the musicians begin. The drums remain controlled, the straw held carefully, and the servants keep their eyes low while the queen stands near the pharaoh. Bowls of scent, lotus flowers, bread and wine sit in front of the divine image. Every object helps turn the ceremony into something more than a display of wealth. The ritual was doing work. What feels most unsettling is that even beauty could be taken into the machinery of kingship, polished until it looked free, while still serving religion, fertility, and royal power. This is why Hathor should not be treated as only a goddess of love in a simple sense. Her image could surround royal women with meanings of joy, music, beauty, motherhood, and fertility, but those meanings were not separate from politics. In Egypt, the graceful and the useful could stand very close together. A queen's headdress could be beautiful and political at the same time. The court did not waste symbols. The queen in the temple courtyard may have looked dignified, calm, and protected. Yet the same signs that honored her also tied her to expectations about birth, ritual, status, and the future of the royal line. Her image could lift her above ordinary life, but it could also hold her inside a role that others needed her to perform. Hathor's softness did not remove the pressure. This part has shown that Hathor's image made royal womanhood appear sacred through beauty, music, motherhood, fertility, and ritual dignity. From the queen's headdress and collar, the story now turns outward toward the Nile itself, where fertility was not only a matter of bodies or temples, but of the land breathing through its yearly flood. So along the riverbank, dark mud could decide whether families ate, whether temples received offerings, and whether Egypt believed the gods were still keeping the country alive. From the temple courtyard, the meaning of fertility moved outward toward the river. The Nile rose near the edge of the fields, dark water touching the banks, while wet mud spread over the ground that farmers would later plant. Men stood near the soft soil with baskets, tools, and bare legs marked by the waterline, while farther away, the roof of a temple sat above the flat land. So at the palace, a report about the flood could matter as much as news from a birth room. The river carried the country's anxiety. For ancient Egypt, fertility was not only about human bodies. It was also about whether the land would receive enough water, whether grain would grow, whether cattle could feed, whether storage rooms would fill, and whether families would survive the year without hunger pressing against their doors. A good flood could make the fields dark and rich. so a weak flood could leave people looking at cracked ground and empty baskets. It is almost strange how a whole kingdom could watch water rise and feel that the gods were speaking through mud. This is why the Nile belonged inside the same story as royal marriage, temple symbols, and divine fertility. The palace cared about heirs because the dynasty had to continue. The temple cared about offerings because divine order had to be maintained. The villagers cared about the flood because bread, beer, cattle, taxes, and children's stomachs depended on it. Different places, same fear. Life had to keep going. Hapi, the god connected with the Nile flood, helps explain how seriously Egyptians treated this force. He was linked with abundance, food, fertility, and the water that allowed crops to grow. To a farmer, such meanings were not distant theology. They were visible in the weight of grain, the health of animals, the number of jars in a storage room, and the amount of food a family could keep through the hard months. The mud was practical before it was symbolic. In a land with little rainfall, the flood was not a pleasant seasonal detail, shaped the calendar, labour, tax grain, chat, temple wealth, and the mood of the countryside. A scribe could measure fields after the water changed them. Officials could think about what would be collected. A family could look at the soil and understand whether the coming year might be easier or crueler. A modern person may think of fertility as a private subject, but along the Nile, it could be measured in wet fields, grain baskets, animal births, and stored food. This made Egyptian religious images feel less strange when placed in context. A figure connected with fertility, a plant held in ritual, a god linked with water, or a carved scene of abundance could all point toward the same need. People needed bodies to produce children, animals to reproduce, fields to grow crops, and the dead to be renewed in the afterlife. The idea stretched across everything, as a river tied it together. One can imagine the palace receiving word of the flood while temple priests prepared offerings. A servant carries a water vessel through a shaded hall. A scribe marks a tablet with numbers from the fields. Outside, farmers step carefully through mud that will later become food. None of these scenes looks like a scandal, yet all of them belong to the deeper meaning of fertility in Egypt. The ordinary objects carried the truth: a basket of grain, a jar of beer, a calf in a pen, a child eating bread, and a priest placing green plants before a god could all speak the same language. So the Nile made that language visible every year. If the water returned well, life seemed supported. If it failed, fear moved through the country faster than any rumour from the palace. What feels most unsettling is that survival could depend on something no king, priest, mother, or farmer could fully command. This also changes how we should read stories about pharaohs and fertility. Later, people often want the strangest version, the most shocking ritual, or the most secret detail. But the Nile reminds us to be careful. Some things may have been symbolic, some may come from later interpretation, and some may be too uncertain to state as fact. The river teaches caution. For Egyptians, fertility was a way of thinking about whether the world still worked. It belonged to childbirth, royal succession, cattle, crops, temple ritual, and the hope that life could return after death. The pharaoh stood inside that system, but he did not create it alone. The Nile, the fields, the gods, and the people all pressed the same question into daily life. Would life continue? By the riverbank, the answer could appear in dark mud under a farmer's feet. In the palace, it could appear in reports, grain counts, and the relief on officials' faces after a good flood. In the temple, it could appear in offerings of bread, wine, plants, and water placed before the gods. Fertility was not hidden away from the world, it was the world's condition. This part has shown that fertility in Egypt was not only a matter of bodies, marriage, or royal heirs, but of the Nile, the fields, grain, cattle, taxes, food, and the survival of the kingdom. That wider meaning now makes the strangest stories about pharaohs and the river much more dangerous to repeat too confidently. Some tales sound shocking when told as fact, but beside the Nile, they may turn out to be symbols, later rumours, or fragile interpretations built on evidence that does not fully hold. A modern researcher's table can look more dangerous than a temple wall. Books lie open beside photographs of reliefs, copies of temple drawings, notes about the Nile, and printed images of fertility gods that make the modern imagination move too quickly. One line may be underlined in pencil, another source may be marked as late, uncertain, or disputed, and a carved image may sit beside a translation that does not answer every question. The room is quiet, but the risk of exaggeration is already there. This is where caution matters. Many strange stories about pharaohs and fertility rituals travel easily because they sound unforgettable. They are repeated online, shortened into shocking claims, and presented as if every detail were proven beyond doubt. But the real evidence can be much thinner. Story may come from symbolic temple imagery, a later writer, a damaged text, a modern interpretation, or a chain of retellings that grew stronger each time someone wanted it to sound stranger. The problem is not always a lack of material. The problem is how quickly people turn a symbol into a scene. A god connected with fertility does not automatically prove a specific act. A temple image does not always describe ordinary behavior. A ritual object, a plant offering, a divine body, or a carved river sign may speak about life, abundance, and a renewal, rather than a literal event that happened exactly as later storytellers describe it. So it is almost too easy to take one carved image, add modern shock, and create a story that sounds clearer than the evidence ever was. This is especially important with pharaohs, because their bodies were already surrounded by religion and politics. A royal gesture in a temple could carry symbolic meaning. So an offering could refer to the Nile, crops, divine force, kingship, or renewal. A fertility image could belong to a serious religious language rather than a hidden personal custom. If the storyteller rushes, the temple becomes a stage for fantasy instead of a place of belief. The desk shows the problem in small objects. So a photograph of a relief may show one thing, while a book beside it explains several possible meanings. A note in the margin may say that a claim is debated. A second source may avoid the story completely. A third may repeat it, but without strong proof. The pieces do not always fit together cleanly. History often leaves gaps. A modern viewer may want one shocking answer, but ancient evidence often gives us broken stones, damaged lines, formal images, and careful uncertainty. That uncertainty does not make the subject boring. It actually makes it more serious. When a story is presented with phrases like "some traditions suggest," "some interpretations argue," or "it may have carried symbolic meaning," the viewer understands that the past is not being forced into a cheap certainty. The mystery remains, but it is held honestly. That is better than pretending the records say more than they do. Strange stories still have value if they are handled carefully. They can show how late people imagined Egypt, how fertility symbols were misunderstood, and how easily sacred imagery becomes scandal when pulled out of context. They can also show the distance between ancient religious language and modern discomfort, but they should not be treated as direct proof unless the evidence can support that weight. What feels most unsettling is that the most popular version of a story can be the least careful one, because shock travels faster than doubt. So when speaking about pharaohs and fertility rituals, the safest path is not to erase the strange material. It is to separate the levels of evidence. A text is not the same as a carved image. A myth is not the same as a court record. A later rumour is not the same as a contemporary inscription. A symbolic act is not the same as a private habit. The difference protects the story, so one can imagine the researcher looking again at the table. The photograph of the temple relief remains interesting. The image of the Nile, still matters. The fertility god still carries power, but the pencil note in the margin changes them, because it reminds us that ancient Egypt is not a place we can enter freely and explain without limits. Some doors stay partly closed. This is why the topic should stay calm even when the details are strange. The strongest version is not the loudest one, so it is the version that lets the symbols remain serious, admits when evidence is uncertain, and refuses to turn every religious image into a hidden bedroom scene. A careful story can still be disturbing, but it does not have to be dishonest. This part has shown that strange stories about pharaohs and fertility rituals should be handled as disputed traditions, symbolic readings, or uncertain interpretations unless the evidence is strong. That careful line now leads into Egyptian art itself, where bodies appear openly but do not always mean what modern eyes think they mean. A painted figure in thin linen, a formal pose, or a carved body on a tomb wall could look intimate today while actually obeying rules of rank, ritual, rebirth, and visual order. A modern visitor stepping into an Egyptian tomb or temple can easily look too quickly. The wall may show figures standing in profile, shoulders turned forward, eyes drawn clearly from the side, and bodies dressed in thin linen shaped by clean lines. Servants may carry lotus flowers, wine jars, oil vessels, bread trays, and folded cloth toward a larger figure seated in formal dignity. Scene may look intimate to modern eyes, but it was not painted like a private photograph. The wall had rules. Egyptian art often used the body to show order, rank, role, youth, beauty, ritual, and rebirth. A body shown clearly did not automatically mean that the society behind it was loose, careless, or driven by pleasure. Standing pose, the size of the figure, the direction of the face, the objects in the hands, and the placement beside gods or offerings all mattered. What looks exposed now could have been part of a fixed visual language, so it is almost lazy to look at a thin linen dress on a tomb wall and decide that an entire civilization must have lived like a modern fantasy. The details around the body are often more important than the body alone. Servant carrying a jar of oil may be part of a scene of offering, care, status, or preparation. A woman holding flowers may speak about fragrance, beauty, ritual, or rebirth. A noble figure shown larger than others may not be larger in life, but higher in importance. Seated person receiving food may be shown not as a casual dinner guest, but as someone placed inside memory and ritual. The image was doing work. This is why hieroglyphs and images should be read carefully. They may look like pictures, but they belong to a complex system of signs, sounds, meanings, rank, and sacred ideas. A bird, a hand, a reed, a body, a vessel, or an eye could carry more than a simple visual description. The same caution applies to painted bodies and temple scenes, because ancient Egyptian was not trying to behave like a camera. A camera catches surfaces. A tomb wall could show youth because youth suggested vitality. It could show smooth skin because ideal beauty mattered in the afterlife. It could show careful clothing because status mattered. It could show offerings because the dead needed to be sustained ritually. So a modern viewer may focus on the exposed shoulder or the thin fabric, while the ancient viewer may have noticed the name, the rank, the offering list, and the proper arrangement of the scene. A person today may see a body first, but an Egyptian scribe or artist could see title, ritual function, social order, and the hope of renewal. This does not mean the Egyptians had no interest in beauty. They clearly cared about appearance, scent, clothing, hair, jewelry, and the ideal presentation of the body. Wigs, collars, oils, linen, mirrors, coal, and perfume jars all belong to a world where the body could be prepared with great care. But care for beauty is not the same as proof of constant indulgence. That difference matters. The tomb or temple wall also had a strong public function. Its images could preserve names, honor the dead, praise the gods, support royal power, and repeat the order people wanted to continue beyond one life. A figure in fine linen might be part of a ritual statement, not a confession of private behavior. A body placed beside offerings might speak about rebirth and continuity, not only attract. The wall was not gossip. One can imagine a painted chamber lit by a small lamp. The colours are still clear in places, while other lines have faded, cracked or been damaged by time. A figure holds a lotus near the face, another carries wine, another presents bread, and a name appears carefully above the scene. The modern visitor may feel close to the body on the wall, but the meaning remains farther away than it first appears. What feels most unsettling is that ancient images can look open and clear, while still hiding their real meaning behind rules most modern viewers no longer know. This is why the strange customs of pharaohs cannot be built only from images. A carved body, a fertility symbol, a thin garment, or a formal pose must be placed beside the context. Was the image in a tomb, a temple, a palace scene, or a mythic setting? So was it about rank, rebirth, divine power, social order, or ideal beauty? Without those questions, the story becomes too easy and too false. The body needs its setting. So Egyptian art may show bodies openly, but openness is not the same as looseness. The images belong to a visual system that joined people, gods, offerings, death, memory, and order. So a modern eye may see suggestion where an ancient system may have meant status, ritual purity, youth, or the hope of life continuing after death. The danger is not that the art is strange. The danger is reading it too simply. This part has shown that Egyptian art could display bodies openly without proving that ancient Egyptians lived as freely or loosely as modern imaginations suggests. That careful way of looking now leads into the myth of Osiris and Isis, where body, death, fertility, and rebirth stand together in one of Egypt's most important sacred stories. It's in that mythic world, a broken body, a grieving goddess, and the birth of Horus could make succession and renewal feel more powerful than any ordinary royal marriage. Inside a temple, the story of Osiris and Isis did not feel like a strange tale told only for entertainment. So carved Isis could appear with the throne sign on her head. Osiris could be shown in wrapped form with dark green or blackened skin, and Horus could stand with the head of a falcon beside the royal signs of kingship. So Pharaoh's image might appear near that sacred world, not as an outsider, but as the living ruler who inherited part of its meaning. The wall brought death, motherhood, fertility, and royal power into one controlled scene. This was not ordinary family drama. Osiris mattered because he joined death with renewal. Isis mattered because she protected, restored, and carried the meaning of motherhood into the sacred story. Horus mattered because his birth and kingship made succession feel divine rather than merely political. In that chain of figures, the body was not treated as something separate from the rule. The broken body still had a future. To modern eyes, the story can feel strange because it places death and fertility very close together. A dead god, a grieving goddess, a divine child, and a throne all belong to the same religious pattern. But, for ancient Egyptians, death was not simply an ending. It could be imagined through preservation, return, protection, and the hope that life could rise again in another form. It is almost strange that a story beginning with death could become one of the strongest ways Egypt explained birth, kingship, and survival. The objects around the temple made that meaning feel practical. Linen wrappings, oil jars, incense bowls, carved names, offering tables, and painted figures all belonged to a world where the body after death still needed care. Osiris was not only a god of the afterlife, he also carried fertility, because the renewal of life and the return of growth were part of the same sacred idea. Death and growth touched each other. Isis made the story more human and more powerful at the same time. She was not simply a grieving figure placed beside a dead god. She was a mother, protector, and force of restoration, and through her, the birth of Horus became a sacred answer to loss. The child was not just a child in myth. He was the sign that the line could continue after violence, grief, and disorder. The palace would have understood that clearly. A royal birth inside the palace could therefore echo something much larger than household hopes. When a child was born near the throne, the court could see not only a baby but continuity after uncertainty. When Horus became the model of kingship, the living pharaoh could be placed inside that same sacred pattern. The ruler was not only the son of a father. He was part of a story about order return. A modern family may see an heir as a matter of inheritance. But in Egypt, the heir could be wrapped in ideas of gods, death, rebirth, and the defeat of chaos. This does not mean every royal birth should be treated as a direct copy of myth. That would be too simple. The safer point is that Egyptian kingship drew strength from stories where the divine family, death, protection, and succession were already connected. Myth gave the court a language for things that ordinary politics could not fully explain. The throne needed sacred language. One can imagine a priest standing before a carved scene while oil smoke darkens the air. The image of Osiris is still, Isis is protective, Horus is alive, and the pharaoh's name is placed where kingship continues. A viewer today might focus on the unusual closeness of body, death, and birth, but the temple was showing something more serious. It was showing that life could return through divine order. What feels most unsettling is that the birth of an heir could be pulled into a story where a dead body, a mother's protection, and a royal child all helped explain why power should continue. This is why the myth of Osiris and Isis is deeper than scandal. It does not simply make the subject stranger. It helps explain why fertility, succession, burial, and kingship could belong to the same world. The pharaoh's body in life and death was surrounded by that pattern. The temple did not separate these things cleanly. A wrapped body, a child's name, a mother's role, a royal crown, and a god story could all speak to the same fear, that order might collapse if life did not continue. Osiris and Isis gave that fear a sacred shape. Horus gave it a royal answer. This part has shown that the myth of Osiris and Isis joined body, death, fertility, motherhood, rebirth, and royal succession into one sacred story. That connection now makes the question of female kingship much more complicated, because the pharaoh was usually presented through the language of Horus and male royal power. When a woman sat on the throne, the palace had to make body, titles, clothing, and public image fit a system that had not been built to explain her easily. A female pharaoh standing before the stone columns would have looked both familiar and unsettling inside the Egyptian system of power. The crown, the staff, the ritual clothing, the carved names, and the priests, lowering their heads, all belonged to a language of kingship that had usually been shaped around male rule. Servants could arrange linen, polish ornaments, prepare oil, and place the symbols of authority in her hands, just as they would for a male pharaoh. Yet the body inside those symbols changed the meaning of the whole scene. The ritual had to explain her. A woman on the throne was not only a question of personal strength. It was a question of how the palace, the temples, the scribes, and the public image of kingship could make her rule appear legitimate. Egyptian royal power was deeply tied to Horus, divine sonship, fatherhood, lineage, and the image of the king as the male protector of order. When a woman ruled as pharaoh, the court had to work carefully with titles, images, clothing, and ritual language. Power needed a readable body. Hatshepsut is the example most people think of first, but even with her, the story should not be reduced to gossip about private life. The more honest focus is public presentation. She could be shown with royal crowns, formal poses, kingly titles, and symbols that placed her within the accepted language of pharaohs. The point was not simply to hide womanhood, but to make kingship recognizable in a system already trained to see the ruler in certain forms. It is almost strange how a throne could accept a woman only after crowns, titles, carved names, and ritual clothing had taught the court how to see her. The objects mattered because they carried authority. A crown was not just a hat. A false beard in royal imagery, a staff, a throne name, a cartouche, a ritual chair, and a line of carved signs could help place the ruler inside a tradition older than any one body. Servant holding a folded linen cloth or a priest preparing incense may have seemed ordinary, but together they helped build the public image of the rule. The body was being translated. This does not mean every female ruler in Egyptian history should be placed into one story. Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Cleopatra, and other powerful women belong to different periods, political conditions, and forms of authority. Some were pharaohs, some were queens, some were royal partners, and some operated in worlds shaped by very different pressures. To mix them too freely would make the history weaker. The details must stay separate. A female pharaoh also reminds us that gender and power were not simple in Egypt. Royal women could hold property, appear in rituals, bear heirs, carry titles, and stand close to divine imagery. But ruling as pharaoh required something more than influence. It required the whole machinery of kingship to present a woman as the proper holder of a role that had been written, painted, and carved for a king. A modern viewer may see only a woman wearing royal clothing, but the Egyptian court had to see whether the gods, the titles, the images, and the old rituals could still make the throne feel stable. Inside the temple, this could become especially important. Priests needed the ruler to perform offerings. Scribes needed names and titles to fit into formal patterns. Artists needed images that viewers would understand. Officials needed continuity because the kingdom could not afford a ruler whose authority looked uncertain every time her body appeared in public ceremony. The palace feared confusion. One can imagine a carved wall where the female pharaoh stands in a kingly pose, holding symbols of rule while gods face her in the same formal order used for other pharaohs. The image does not tell us what she felt in private. It tells us how the state wanted her to be seen. Her body became part of a public argument written in stone. What feels most unsettling is that even a powerful woman on the throne had to pass through a system that could honor her while reshaping her into the image it already understood. This is why her story belongs in a discussion about royal bodies. So Pharaoh's body had always been more than private, and a female pharaoh makes that truth easier to see. Her clothing, titles, posture, and public images were not small details. They were tools used to make authority acceptable. So the question was not simply whether a woman could rule. The question was how Egypt could make its rule look like pharaohship. The answer was built from stone, cloth, names, crowns, rituals, and a careful presentation of the body. Power had to be arranged before it could be believed. This part has shown that when a woman became pharaoh, the problem was not only her sex, but how the entire royal system could make her body, titles, clothing, and image fit the language of kingship. That question now leads toward the Amarna period, where royal family images became unusually intimate and strange to modern eyes. It's under the rays of Aten, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters could appear almost tender on stone, while the whole family scene still worked as religious propaganda rather than simple private life. The Amarna image can look surprisingly gentle at first glance. Akhenaten and Nefertiti sit beneath the rays of Aten, their daughters close to them, small hands touching parents, soft bodies arranged in a way that feels more personal than many older royal scenes. Sun disk sends down long rays that end in little hands, some holding the ankh near royal faces as if life itself is being handed to the family. To modern eyes, it can feel almost like a private family moment preserved on stone. That feeling is only part of the picture. Amarna art is famous. because it looks different from the older, more rigid style of Egyptian royal imagery. The bodies are more unusual, the gestures more intimate, and the royal daughters appear in scenes that seem warmer than expected. But those details should not be taken too quickly as a simple domestic truth. A carved family scene could still be a political and religious message. It is almost tempting to look at Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters under the Aten, and forget that even tenderness could be arranged for public belief. Akhenaten's religious change placed Aten at the centre of royal life, and the royal family became deeply tied to that new visual language. The pharaoh was not shown only as a ruler sitting apart from everyone. He and Nefertiti could appear with their children beneath the same divine rays, making the family itself look like the chosen channel through which divine life reached the world. The scene may feel personal, but it also places the royal household at the centre of a new sacred order. The family became a religious statement. This is why the image should be handled carefully. It would be easy to invent private stories about Akhenaten and Nefertiti, or to treat every intimate pose as evidence of hidden palace life. That would be a mistake. The more honest reading is that Amarna images used family closeness to communicate something about religion, kingship, and the special place of the royal household under Aten. Before going deeper, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if you enjoy this careful kind of history. It helps the story reach more people who want ancient Egypt explained without turning every strange image into a cheap scandal. Then return to the Amarna relief, because the most unsettling thing is not that the family looks intimate, but that the intimacy itself may be part of the message. A small hand touching a royal parent looks harmless. A daughter sitting close to Nefertiti can seem like a soft detail from real family life. But on a carved relief, even softness can be shaped by purpose. The child, the mother, the father, the sun rays, the ankh, and the formal arrangement all work together. So a modern viewer may see a family scene, but the Amarna court could see a religious program written through shadow, children, light, and royal closeness. The presence of the daughters matters. They do not appear only as background children filling space. Their bodies help make the royal family visible as a living unit, protected and energized by Aten. They also remind the viewer that succession, fertility, and royal continuity remained important even inside this unusual religious experiment. The children are tender figures, but they are not only tender. The stone gives them work to do. Nefertiti's place also deserves care. She appears prominently in many Amarna images, sometimes with striking authority. That does not mean we should turn her into a modern romantic heroine or build unsupported stories about her private life. Her image carried religious and political weight, and that is already half powerful enough. A queen beside Akhenaten could help make the new order appear complete, visible, and stable. Her body was part of the message too. Objects and signs around the scene make it clearer. The sun disk above, the rays ending in hands, the ankh signs, the chairs, the collars, the carved names, and the formal placement of bodies all turn family into theology. Nothing in the scene has to be accidental. Even a child's posture could belong to the larger design. So what feels most unsettling is that a scene that looks warm and human could also be used to teach people where sacred power was supposed to flow. This does not mean the royal family had no real affection. They may have had ordinary feelings, attachments, griefs, and household routines that no relief can fully show. But the image on the wall is not a window left open by accident. It is a crafted public surface. It tells us how the royal family wanted to be seen, not everything they were. That distinction keeps the history honest. The Amarna period, therefore, adds a new layer to the story of royal bodies. earlier parts showed how marriage, heirs, queens, fertility gods, and temple symbols could turn the body into a public tool. Amarna shows that even family closeness could become part of religious transformation. The palace did not need to hide all intimacy. It could display it. The strange power of the Amarna family image lies in that mixture. Feels close, but it is also controlled. It feels domestic, but it is also sacred. It feels human, but it is also propaganda carved for a world being told to look toward Aten through the royal household. This part has shown that the Amarna royal family image could look intimate while still serving religion, kingship, and public messaging under Aten. That carefully arranged closeness now leads toward Tutankhamun, whose short life and buried body bring the story back to the cost of royal bloodlines. Inside his tomb, gold could shine around a young king, while questions about family, health, and close royal marriage sat quietly beside the body itself. Tutankhamun's tomb does not first feel like a medical warning. It feels like a room where gold has been left to glow in the dark for too long. The burial chamber was filled with a golden mask, ritual beds, chariots, small boxes, jars, furniture, linen, jewellery, and objects made for a king who died young. Under all that beauty, there was still a body. The gold did not remove weakness. Tutankhamun is often pulled into modern story about royal bloodlines because he is famous, young, and surrounded by mystery. Some modern studies have discussed family relationships and possible health issues in connection with his remains. That makes the subject powerful, but also dangerous if it is told too simply. Close marriage in royal families can increase health risks across generations, but one king's condition should not be turned into a neat answer without care. It is almost too easy to look at a fragile young king and blame every broken part of him on one dramatic royal habit. The tomb itself reminds us to slow down. A cane, a chariot, a bed, a sealed jar, a folded cloth, and a small object placed near the body can invite questions, but they do not always answer them. Archaeology gives fragments. Medicine gives possibilities. DNA studies and physical examination can suggest relationships or conditions, but they do not turn every illness into a single cause. The evidence needs room. Tutankhamun belonged to a royal world where bloodline mattered deeply. The court cared about descent, legitimacy, divine kingship, and the continuation of the throne. In that world, keeping power inside the royal family could seem useful to the palace. Even when the human body carried risks, the system did not fully understand. The frightening part is not only the young king's condition, it is the logic around him. Before going deeper, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if you enjoy this careful kind of history. It helps the story reach more people who want ancient Egypt explained without turning every royal body into a cheap mystery. Then return to the tomb, because the most disturbing detail is not the gold, but the body lying inside it. A royal child could be born into expectation before anyone knew what his health would become. His name could be written, his place prepared, his claim watched, and his future imagined by adults who needed the dynasty to continue. If close kinship strengthened the appearance of royal blood, the court might value that appearance more than the unseen danger building across generations. Power often thinks about tomorrow's throne before tomorrow's body. A modern family might see inherited illness as a private tragedy, but in a royal palace, even a weak body could still be wrapped in titles, ceremony, and political need. This does not mean Tutankhamun should be used as proof for every claim about ancient Egyptian royal marriage. That would be careless. His case must be handled as a mixture of archaeology, medical interpretation, family history, and uncertainty. The stronger story is not that we know everything about why he suffered or died. The stronger story is that royal power could surround a vulnerable body with gold and still fail to protect it. The burial room makes that clear. The mask shines, the objects are careful, and the ritual equipment tries to carry the king into eternity. But the body beneath the mask had lived limits no throne could erase. A palace could protect a title, preserve a name, and fill a tomb with treasure, but it could not make bloodline politics harmless. So what feels most unsettling is that the same system built to protect royal power could also place royal bodies at risk that gold, ritual, and titles could not undo. Tutankhamun's story therefore belongs to this subject, but only if it is told carefully. He shows why the royal body cannot be treated only as a symbol, because under every crown there was still flesh, bone, illness, and death. He also shows why a close royal marriage should not be written as a simple scandal. It was part of a political and sacred system, and that system could leave human consequences. The young king's tomb is beautiful, but it is not comforting. It shows wealth, ritual, care, and weakness in the same dark space. It reminds us that a body can be surrounded by the greatest symbols of power and remain breakable. In the end, the pharaoh was not only an image on a wall, he was a body that could fail. This part has shown that Tutankhamun should not be used for careless claims, but his tomb still reveals the fragile body beneath the royal bloodline, gold, and sacred titles. That fragility now leads back into the living palace, where the royal body was cross-prepared, scented, dressed, and presented before gods and people, in the rooms of oil jars, wigs, cosmetics, folded linen, and polished mirrors. The pharaoh's body could be made to look divine even when it remained painfully human. Inside the palace, preparation for the ceremony could begin with a wooden box opened by careful hands. Inside it lay combs, black wigs, small jars of scented oil, mineral powders, folded linen, polished collars, and pieces of jewellery placed in separate spaces. Sunlight came through a high window and fell across the stone floor, while a servant lifted a cloth and another held a water vessel ready near the chair. The room looked calm, but every object had a purpose. This was not only grooming. The royal body had to be made presentable in a way that went beyond personal taste. Soil could soften the skin, scent could mark refinement, linen could make the body appear clean, and cosmetics could shape the face into something controlled and worthy of public view. A wig was not only hair, and a collar was not only decoration. Together, they helped turn a human body into a royal image. It is almost strange how much labour could be spent making one body look natural, divine, and effortless before it stepped into the ceremony. Ancient Egypt cared deeply about appearance, but palace appearance should not be reduced to vanity. Pharaoh, queen, or royal woman could be washed, scented, dressed, painted, and adorned because the body had to face gods, priests, officials, and the eyes of the court. A jar of oil, a folded towel, a bronze mirror, and a tray of mineral colour belonged to a practical routine, but also to a sacred one. The body was being prepared to carry meaning. The servants knew the order of things. One might arrange the linen, one might bring the wig, one might open a small vessel of perfume, and another might hold the broad collar before it was placed on the chest. The person being dressed may have felt heat, tiredness, boredom, or impatience while the work continued. But the ritual did not care only about comfort. The image had to survive the body. A polished mirror could show the face of a ruler, but it could not show the whole truth of the role. Under the oil and scent was still skin that could sweat, age, ache, and weaken. Under the wig was still a head that could feel heavy. Under the collar was still a chest that breathed like any other body. A modern person may use perfume or cosmetics to feel more attractive, but in the palace, these things could help make the royal body acceptable before gods and people. This is why the scene can feel both luxurious and suffocating. The scent of oil might be pleasant, the linen smooth, the jewellery expensive, and the wig carefully made, yet each layer added to the distance between the person and ordinary life. The more carefully the body was prepared, the less it seemed allowed to appear as itself. For royal women, the same pressure could appear in another form. A queen's collar, perfume, wig, headdress, and linen could make her look graceful, but they could all place certain expectations of rank, fertility, beauty, and ritual dignity. A princess might be dressed for a ceremony with flowers near her hands and scent placed behind her ears. Softness of the room did not remove the weight of the role. The palace used beauty as language. This does not mean every act of grooming was cold or empty. People could enjoy scent, cosmetics, clean linen, and fine objects. Ancient Egyptians used beauty and body care in many contexts, not only in royal ritual, but in the palace. The same ordinary pleasures could be absorbed into hierarchy, religion, and public display. A pleasant smell could become part of power. What feels most unsettling is that care for the body could make the pharaoh look more honored, while also making him less free. When the preparation ended, the room would not keep the body for itself. The pharaoh or queen would step out toward the corridor, past servants, holding boxes, jars, fans, and cloth. Beyond the door waited priests, officials, offerings, temple spaces, and carved signs that would receive the prepared body as if it were already more than human. The oils and cosmetics did not create freedom. They created a surface fit for ritual. The palace turned washing, scent, hair, cloth, and jewelry into a quiet form of control. The body was cared for, but the care had a purpose beyond comfort. It had to appear clean, ordered, elevated, and worthy of the gods. So even beauty became a duty. This part has shown that royal scent, wigs, cosmetics, linen, and oil were not only about beauty, but about preparing the royal body for ceremony, rank, and divine presence. That prepared body now leads toward death, where Egypt did not stop caring for the pharaoh's flesh, even after breath was gone. The embalming place could fill with linen, resin, jars, and priestly hands, continuing the same disturbing work, turning a dead body into something meant to live again. The embalming place would not have felt like the end of the pharaoh's body. Its linen lay in careful rolls near the wall, dark resin shone in small vessels, canopic jars stood ready, and priestly hands moved through work that was both physical and sacred. The dead king no longer breathed, yet his names, bones, organs, wrappings, and future still mattered to the people around him. Death had changed the body, but had not released it from meaning. The body still had duties. For ancient Egypt, death did not simply erase a person. It opened another stage in which the body, the name, the tomb, the offerings, and the correct rituals helped the dead continue in the world beyond. This mattered for many Egyptians, but for a pharaoh the weight was even greater. His body had been a symbol of kingship in life, and after death it could become part of a sacred journey toward renewal. It is almost unsettling that even after death, a pharaoh's body could still be washed, handled, wrapped, named, and prepared as if power had not finished using him. The objects in the room were quiet, but none of them were meaningless. Linen could protect and shape the body. Resin could preserve, scent, and seal. Canopic jars could hold what had been removed and guarded. Amulets, wrappings, oil, carved signs, and spoken formulas all belonged to a belief that survival after death required care. The dead body was not treated as waste. Osiris helps explain why this mattered so deeply. He was linked with the afterlife, fertility, renewal, and the hope that life could return after loss. The pharaoh's death could be placed inside that larger pattern where the dead king did not simply vanish but moved toward another form of existence. The wrapped body, the tomb's chamber, and the protected name all helped make that passage understandable. Death and fertility met again. A modern viewer might find this strange because the dead body feels like the opposite of fertility. But Egyptian thought could place the tomb beside rebirth, the wrapped body beside renewal, and the setting sun beside its return. So Nile rose after seeming to withdraw. Plants grew again from dark soil, and the sun crossed the sky in a cycle that repeated. The body of the dead pharaoh could be drawn into that same rhythm. A person today may think of burial as farewell, but for Egypt, the tomb could become a carefully supplied place where life was expected to continue in another form. This did not make death soft. The room would still have been cold in its meaning. The body had to be opened, dried treat, wrapped and protected. Human weakness was present in every practical step, even when the words around it were sacred. A king who once wore collars, wigs, linen and perfume now depended on other hands to keep his body from decay. The contrast was hard to miss. In life, servants had prepared the pharaoh for the ceremony with oil, cloth, scent and jewellery. In death, other hands prepared him again linens, resin, jars, amulets and ritual speech. The process looked different, but the deeper pattern remained similar. The royal body still had to be shaped into something acceptable for a world larger than ordinary human comfort. The palace had become a tomb. So what feels most disturbing is that death did not return the pharaoh to privacy, because even his corpse could be made to serve rebirth, royal memory, and sacred order. This is why mummification belongs in a story about the royal body. It shows that the pharaoh's flesh was not important only because of marriage, fertility, heirs, or public ceremony. It remained important when the body was silent. It had to carry identity, power, continuity, and hope beyond the moment when ordinary life ended. The tomb also carried political weight. A preserved body, a protected name, and a rich burial could help make the king's memory stable. The new ruler could stand on the idea that the old ruler had passed properly into sacred order. Funerary ritual was therefore not only about grief. It helped protect the continuity of kingship. A dead king could still support the living throne. One can imagine the final wrapping being placed with slow hands. The linen tightens around the limbs, resin darkens the surface, and a priest speaks words meant to protect what remains. Nearby, jars, labels, amulets, and carved signs wait for their place in the system. The pharaoh has no voice in the room, but everyone is still working for what his body is supposed to become. That silence is the coldest part. The strange customs around pharaohs, therefore, do not stop at desire or birth. They continue through death, preservation, and the belief that life could be remade. The body that once stood before gods now lay before priests. The same civilization that connected fertility to fields, airs, animals, and river mud also connected death to renewal. This part has shown that for a pharaoh, death did not erase the body, but turned it into part of a sacred journey of preservation, rebirth, and royal continuity. That deeper world of symbols now forces a careful warning, because not every carved image, tomb object, or strange ritual permits us to invent private lives for the dead. A broken relief, a damaged inscription, or a misunderstood symbol can tempt a storyteller into creating a scandal that the evidence itself never truly says. So broken relief can be more dangerous than a complete wall. One half of a carved line may be missing. A translation may sit open on the table, and a photograph of a tomb scene may show a body, a vessel, or a god, without explaining exactly how it was understood. Nearby, there may be notes from archaeologists, modern books, old drawings, and one famous story from the internet that sounds too clear to be safe. The space invites invention. This is where history can begin to slip. Ancient Egypt left behind temples, tombs, statues, mummies, amulets, texts, tools, jars, paintings, and carved names, but not every question can be answered from them. Some evidence is broken, some words are hard to translate, some scenes are ritual rather than everyday life, some images were made to show divine meaning, not private behavior. The problem is not that the past is silent. The problem is that it speaks in pieces, and people often want those pieces to form a complete scandal. A fertility god becomes a supposed custom. A symbolic image becomes a secret act. So damaged inscription becomes a confident claim in a video title or a short article that never explains where the idea came from. It is almost frightening how one uncertain carving can become a full story once someone adds confidence, shock, and a little imagination. This is especially risky with pharaohs because their bodies were already surrounded by symbols. So royal body in art could mean power, renewal, fertility, death, divine approval, or the continuation of the kingdom. A ritual object could belong to a temple ceremony, a funeral belief, or a mythic story. A modern viewer may want one simple answer, but the evidence often asks for slower reading, so text is not the same as an image. A tomb painting is not the same as a palace record. A mummy can tell us something about a body, but not every private detail of a life. And a modern interpretation can be useful, but it should not be treated as ancient testimony unless it is clearly supported. Categories matter because mixing them too quickly creates false certainty. That is how errors grow. A modern audience may enjoy a shocking claim, but the ancient material often gives us cracked stone, formals as missing names, and careful limits. One can imagine the table again. Its photograph of a temple wall lies beside a sketch of a fertility god, a book on kingship, a note about Osiris, and a printed article repeating a famous story without strong sourcing. The objects look scholarly from a distance, yet if the storyteller does not separate evidence from speculation, the whole scene can become a machine for making myth sound proven. The safest language is often the most honest language. Some traditions suggest, some interpretations argue, it may have carried symbolic meaning. The evidence is uncertain, so these phrases may sound less dramatic, but they protect the subject from becoming fiction. So they also make the strangeness feel more real, because the viewer understands that the past is not being forced to confess more than it knows. So what feels most unsettling is that the most popular version of a story can be the weakest one, because certainty travels faster than caution. This does not mean the topic should become dull. Strange royal customs, fertility symbols, temple scenes, and myths can still be powerful when handled carefully. The mystery does not disappear because the wording becomes cautious. In fact, it often becomes stronger because the viewer can feel the distance between what survives and what has been lost. A broken relief still matters. A damaged text still matters. A mummy or a carved name, a temple figure, and a funerary object still matter. But each one has limits, so none of them gives automatic permission to invent a life for someone who died thousands of years ago. The pharaoh's body has already been used enough by history. It was used by the kingship, temple ritual, succession, burial, and later imagination. A careful storyteller should not use it again carelessly. So the goal is not to remove the strange parts, but to keep them connected to evidence, context, and uncertainty. So the final question should change. It should not only ask what the pharaoh did behind closed doors. It should ask why Egyptian religion, politics, art, marriage, death, and fertility placed so much meaning on the royal body in the first place. That question is less cheap and far more disturbing. This part has shown that the greatest danger in telling stories about pharaohs and sexuality is not the lack of strange material, but the temptation to turn fragments, symbols, and later claims into certainty. That warning now leads toward the larger meaning of the royal body, where palace, temple, tomb, Nile, heirs, gods and images all meet in one system of power. The most disturbing truth may not be one secret act at all, but the way an entire civilization could make one human body and carry the order of the world. So by late afternoon in Thebes, the body of the pharaoh could seem to exist in several places at once. The temple shadows stretched across stone, the palace sat quiet behind linen curtains, and the Nile fields reflected a red light that made the water look heavier than it was. Far away inside a tomb, a royal name could still be carved to keep a dead king alive in memory and ritual. The same body had been held by the palace, the temple, the river, and the grave. That is the larger strangeness. Modern viewers often come looking for one shocking custom. They want a hidden act, a forbidden room, a strange marriage, or a ritual that sounds impossible to forget. But ancient Egypt was not strange only because of one private behavior. It was strange to modern eyes because it could make one royal body carry the weight of gods, heirs, harvests, offerings, death, and the order of the country. The scandal is smaller than the system. In the palace, the pharaoh's body was tied to succession. His marriages mattered because children mattered, and children mattered because the throne needed a future. A queen's title, a child's name, a birth room, a linen blanket, and a scribe's record could all become part of a political question. The body of the king was never only a body when the next ruler might come from it. It is almost strange how people search for secret pleasure, while the more disturbing fact is that the palace could turn even birth into a matter of state survival. In the temple, the same body was pulled toward the gods. Pharaoh stood with bread, wine, flowers, green plants, oil, and incense, not simply as a van making a private offering, but as the ruler expected to maintain divine order. Fertility appeared there as river flood, grain, cattle, children, and rebirth, not as a crude joke. What looks strange now often belonged to a serious language of life continuing. The offering table was political too. At the river, the pharaoh's meaning became wider again. The Nile did not rise because the king wished it to rise, yet the king's image was tied to the hope that Egypt remained in order. A good flood could fill fields with dark mud, make grain grow, feed animals, and bring relief to families counting baskets of food. A poor flood could make divine order feel fragile. A modern ruler may be judged by laws or speeches, but an Egyptian pharaoh could be imagined beside water levels, grain stores, temple offerings, royal children, and the safety of the dead. In the tomb, the body was not released even after death. Linen, resin, canopic jars, amulets, carved names, and priestly words kept working on the dead pharaoh, as if the royal body still had a journey to complete. The body that once wore collars and oil now needed wrappings and preservation. Even silence could not make it ordinary. This is why the word strange has to be used carefully. Strange means strange to us, not necessarily strange to the people who lived inside that system. To them, many symbols around fertility, kingship, death, and rebirth belonged to religion, politics, and the practical fear that life could fail. If we treat those symbols only as entertainment, we lose their real weight. But what feels most unsettling is that the pharaoh did not simply rule Egypt, because Egypt also ruled the meaning of his body. The body in the palace had to produce continuity. The body in the temple had to stand before the gods. The body in art had to appear ordered and powerful. The body in death had to be preserved for rebirth. Each space took something human and turned it into a tool for explaining the world. A crown, a seal, a linen roll, a river report, a birth record, a perfume jar, and a tomb inscription could all belong to this same structure. None of them alone explains the whole subject. Together, they show a civilization that placed the pharaoh at the center of its imagination of survival. The king's body became the place where private life, sacred duty, and political fear met. That is more chilling than gossip. So the point of this story is not to ask only what the pharaoh did behind palace doors. The better question is why so many doors, temple gates, tomb chambers, riverbanks, and birth rooms all seem to lead back to him. His body was used to speak about fertility, inheritance, divine favor, harvest, death, and renewal. The man could disappear under the meanings placed on him. By evening, Thebes could look peaceful. The river darkened, temple walls cooled, palace servants folded cloth, and somewhere a carved royal name waited in stone. Yet behind that calm was a system that had made one body carry the imagined balance of an entire world. This part has shown that the strangest thing was not one isolated custom, but the way Egypt placed the pharaoh's body at the center of palace, temple, river, tomb, fertility, and order. That wider truth now leads to the final question, not how many secrets the pharaoh had, but whether any part of him truly belonged to himself. Beneath the crown, linen, oil, heirs, rituals, and carved names. The most powerful man in Egypt may have been a man whose own body had already been swallowed by the throne. Night settled slowly over the Nile, and the palace no longer looked like a place of endless power. Oil lamps burned behind linen curtains, servants' footsteps faded along stone corridors, and a pharaoh could stand near a carved window while the river reflected a thin line of moonlight. Farther away, the temple still held its own light, quiet but watchful, while priests, wives, children, guards, scribes, and old expectations remained close, even when no one spoke. The day ended, but the roll did not. This is where the story becomes sadder than scandal. After all the strange symbols, unusual marriages, fertility gods, royal children, temple scenes, and tomb rituals, the final truth is not that we know every private act of every pharaoh. We do not. Too much evidence is missing. Too many images are symbolic, and too many later stories have been repeated with more confidence than they deserve. What can be said more carefully is that the royal body in Egypt was often understood through divine power, succession, ritual, fertility, public image, and the needs of the throne. The mystery is not only behind the door. The pharaoh could be the most powerful persons in Egypt, yet that power did not give him complete ownership of himself. His marriage could belong to the bloodline. His children could belong to the succession. His body in the temple could belong to the gods. His corpse could belong to embalming, rebirth, royal memory, and the hope that his name would continue. It is almost cruel that a man surrounded by crowns, guards, gold, oil, linen, and carved titles could still have less private ownership of his own body than a farmer sleeping beside the riverbank. The objects around him tell the story better than any rumor. A broad collar could make him look divine. A jar of oil could prepare him for the ceremony. A sealed record could protect the name of an heir. A birth room could decide the mood of the palace. So a tomb inscription could keep seeking for Matama. His mouth was closed forever. The throne reached through everything. His intimate life was tied to too many forces at once. A wife was not only a wife when her child might continue the royal line. A queen was not only a woman beside him, but her title could help the throne appear legitimate. A child was not only a child when a name, a mother, and a record could decide who stood closer to power. Even affection, if it existed, had to live under the weight of politics. A palace could make tenderness useful. The temple added another layer. Fertility was not only about bodies, but about grain, cattle, river mud, offerings, and the return of life after death. Gods such as Horus, Hathor, Isis, Osiris, Hapi, and Min surrounded the royal body with meanings that were serious in their own world, even when they looked strange to modern eyes. The pharaoh stood among these meanings as a ruler, symbol, servant of ritual, and proof that order still existed. A modern viewer may search for the secret pleasure of the pharaoh, but ancient Egypt more often shows us a body trapped inside duty, ritual, inheritance, and public belief. Death did not free him either. The embalming room continued what the palace had started. Linen, resin, canopic jars, amulets, priestly hands, and carved names worked on the dead body as carefully as servants once worked on the living one. A pharaoh could stop breathing, but Egypt still had use for his flesh. That is a cold kind of eternity. This is why the subject should not end with a list of shocking customs. It should end with the image of a man who became too important to remain fully human in public memory. He may have desired, feared, loved, aged, suffered, or felt tired under the weight of ceremony, but most of that disappeared behind crowns and stone. History preserved the role far more clearly than the person. What feels most unsettling is that the Pharaoh's body was made sacred, but that sacredness also turned it into something the kingdom could claim. So when the last lamp burned inside the palace, the silence was not empty. It held the queen's title, the heir's name, the priest's ritual, the scribe's record, the god's image, the farmer's flood, and the tomb waiting beyond life. Every part of the royal body had been pulled into a larger story. The man inside it was almost impossible to find. The final mystery is not what the pharaoh did after the doors closed. It is why an entire civilization needed his body to imagine order, fertility, death, rebirth, and survival. The answer is not simple, and it should not be made cheaply. It sits somewhere between the Nile, the palace, the temple, and the tomb. Its final part has shown that the deepest truth was not a hidden royal scandal, but the way Egypt could make the pharaoh's body carry gods, heirs, rituals, fertility, death, and the survival of the kingdom. So when the palace lamps faded and the Nile turned dark, the most powerful man in Egypt seemed less like a free man than a sacred body claimed by everyone around him. Thank you for staying with this strange and quiet journey through ancient Egypt, and may the night settle gently around you as you rest, breathe slowly, and sleep well.